The road into the Kentucky backwoods narrowed until it was barely more than a trail swallowed by trees. The map had long stopped updating, and even the GPS gave up somewhere past the rusted sign that warned private property, trespassers will be shot. The air grew thicker there, heavy with the smell of damp soil and rot, the kind that clings to your lungs and whispers you should turn back. But curiosity, dangerous, hungry curiosity, kept him moving. Locals had called it the Hollow. They said it wasn't just a place, but a curse that the land refused to forget. A century ago, a family settled here, cut off from everyone and everything. Over the decades, the bloodline twisted in on itself, generation after generation, until no one outside their circle was allowed to enter or leave. Their children were never seen. Their windows were always covered. The mailman stopped delivering there decades ago, and the few who wandered too close told stories of shadows that didn't walk quite right. As he stepped deeper into the woods, the silence changed. It wasn't quiet, it was listening. The trees leaned closer, their branches crooked like reaching fingers. He thought he saw movement among them, small, bent shapes darting away from the light. His camera trembled in his hand, the red record light blinking like a heartbeat. The farmhouse appeared through the fog, sagging under its own age, windows black as empty eyes. Something was alive in there. Something that shouldn't have been. He didn't yet know that the family inside had spent decades hiding what nature had done to them, children born of bloodlines too close, bodies reshaped by secrets too dark to name. And tonight, he wasn't the one discovering them. They had been waiting for him. Deep within the Kentucky wilderness lies a forgotten village, hidden from maps and erased from memory, where silence feels almost alive. It's the kind of place where fog never fully lifts and daylight filters through the trees as if afraid to touch the ground. The locals, few and wary, still talk about the woods, but only in whispers, and only when they're sure no outsider is listening. They say there's something out there that shouldn't exist, a presence that watches from behind the dark pines, a secret buried so deep in the soil that even the earth itself tries to cover it up. No one remembers when the first house in that valley was built, or who claimed the land, but everyone agrees that it has always been there rotting, waiting, breathing quietly in the dark. The oldest men in town, their eyes dull and hands trembling, recall a time when families lived out near that valley, people who never came into town, who grew their own food, and who seemed to multiply without anyone ever seeing a stranger among them. They never bought supplies, never sold their harvests, never asked for help. Their children didn't go to school, and their names appeared nowhere in county records. When a census taker once tried to reach the area, he vanished along with his car. Weeks later, they found his notebook miles from where he was last seen, the pages soaked in rain and smeared with words no one could read. The sheriff said wild animals must have taken him, but the locals stopped going near the woods after that. They said the forest had its own way of keeping secrets. Decades passed, and the world outside forgot the place ever existed. The main road was rerouted, and new towns grew miles away. Only a few hunters and drifters ever stumbled into the region, and most never returned to speak of it. Those who did come back told stories that no one believed, of strange shapes moving through the fog, of distant cries that didn't sound human, of windows glowing deep in the trees long after midnight. The few who tried to investigate ended up abandoning the effort, shaken by a feeling that the woods themselves wanted them gone. Even the birds avoided that valley. No wind touched its trees. The village became nothing more than a rumor passed down through generations, a warning told to children who might wander too far. And yet, buried within those warnings was a truth that no one wanted to confront, that somewhere deep in those woods, an entire bloodline had chosen to disappear, taking with it a secret darker than any ghost story whispered in the hills. The story of the forgotten Kentucky village might have remained nothing more than a ghost tale passed among the locals if not for the arrival of a young documentary filmmaker, drawn not by superstition but by curiosity wrapped in ambition. He had spent months chasing whispers of hidden American tragedies, stories buried beneath generations of silence, and the mention of a family that had cut itself off from the world stirred something dangerous in him. His name was known among small indie circles. He had a talent for finding beauty in horror, truth in darkness. When he first heard about the isolated family rumored to live deep in the Kentucky woods, he dismissed it as folklore. But the more he researched, the more he realized that the rumors weren't built from thin air. Missing persons, incomplete birth records, unmarked graves, it was enough to make the unbelievable seem possible. He arrived in the nearest town one damp morning in early autumn, carrying little more than his camera gear, a recorder, and a notebook full of newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. The town itself seemed frozen in time, its single diner filled with people who stopped talking the moment he walked in. When he asked about the woods to the west, their expressions changed from suspicion to fear. One old man told him there were things out there that ain't meant for cameras. A woman behind the counter whispered that even the sheriff refused to go near the Hollow Star. They warned him that the land was cursed, that the people who once lived there didn't welcome strangers, and that some doors were never meant to be opened. But he only smiled politely, jotting every word down like evidence in a growing mystery. He was convinced that behind every myth lies a truth, twisted perhaps, exaggerated over time, but still rooted in something real. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town, spending his days recording interviews with anyone willing to speak and his nights studying old maps that showed a settlement long since erased. Locals grew uneasy seeing his car drive toward the woods at dusk. The deeper he dug, the more he felt something pulling him in, as though the story itself wanted to be found. What began as a simple investigation soon became an obsession. There was something about that family, that stretch of uncharted land, that called to him in ways he couldn't explain. He told himself he was chasing truth, but in reality, truth was chasing him, waiting for him to cross the invisible line that had protected the family's secret for generations. The locals had many names for the woods, but the filmmaker kept hearing one in particular, the Hollow. It was always spoken quietly, as if saying it too loud might summon something from within. Every mention carried a weight, a pause, a flicker of memory no one wished to revisit. The Hollow wasn't marked on any map. The roads that once led there were little more than overgrown trails swallowed by weeds and time. It existed somewhere between fact and fear, a place the townspeople refused to acknowledge except when warning outsiders to stay away. When the filmmaker first asked about it, the reaction was the same: a glance toward the window, a muttered prayer, and then silence. No one wanted to describe it, but their eyes told stories their tongues would not. One evening, while recording interviews in the local bar, an old hunter spoke after several drinks loosened his restraint. He said the Hollow wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by the living. According to him, strange lights sometimes flickered deep in the trees at night, faint yellow glows that moved like lanterns carried by invisible hands. The air there was different, thick and metallic, and sometimes he'd hear voices echoing from nowhere, calling names he didn't recognize. He had once ventured close enough to see a wooden fence half swallowed by moss and a sign so faded it was impossible to read. What he remembered most, though, was the feeling that someone or something was watching from the shadows. He swore he saw shapes shifting between the trees, small and quick, but not quite human in the way they moved. The filmmaker listened, half skeptical, half entranced. Every account, every warning, made him want to go there more. He began mapping out the Hollow's approximate location using old county survey charts and stories from locals who had lost livestock or wandered too far while hunting. Each clue pointed to a stretch of dense forest at the edge of the abandoned county line. It was a place forgotten by law, by history, and seemingly by time itself. As the nights grew colder, he started dreaming of the hollowed dark trees swaying without wind, a faint whispering just beyond his hearing, and eyes glinting in the dark. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, but his determination never wavered. He believed the Hollow wasn't just a patch of woods but a doorway to something hidden, something that had shaped decades of silence in this forgotten corner of Kentucky. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had to see it for himself. Every warning only pushed him closer to the edge, closer to the place no one dared enter after dark, where the trees grew too close and the air carried the scent of old, unburied secrets. Old records became the filmmaker's only source of truth when living voices refused to speak. He spent nights in the county archive, a small, dust-choked room beneath the courthouse where files were stacked without order and time itself seemed suspended. What he discovered there was not a single mystery, but a pattern, one that reached back more than 100 years. Property deeds, birth certificates, and death records all traced back to one piece of land, deep within the forest at the heart of the Hollow. The name on the earliest deed was *Ellis*, a family that had once been prosperous farmers before vanishing from all public mention. After that, the documents grew strange. The same surnames appeared repeatedly, often in connection with one another, sometimes even on the same date. Births and deaths overlapped, family lines folded into themselves. There were no new names, no evidence of marriage outside the family. The bloodline had never left the property. In one brittle ledger, he found the record of a missing child from a neighboring town dated 1934. The file was incomplete, but a note scribbled in pencil mentioned possible connection to the Ellis property. There were other disappearances, farmhands, drifters, a census worker in the 1950s, all last seen heading toward that same region. A faded sheriff's report from decades later referenced an uncooperative family living off-grid who refused inspection. The sheriff's name had been crossed out, and the report ended abruptly without a signature. Every trace of follow-up was missing, as if someone had deliberately erased the story from official memory. By now, the filmmaker was convinced that what had started as isolation had turned into obsession for the family. He pictured a dynasty buried alive, its members trapped within the boundaries of their own land, sustained by soil and secrecy. He imagined the children growing up with no knowledge of the outside world, no understanding of faces beyond their own reflection. The further he read, the colder the room seemed to grow. He noticed one file stamped sealed by County Order 1972, its pages inaccessible to the public. When he asked about it, the clerk only shrugged, saying those files had been off-limits for decades and that the last person who tried to access them had gone missing shortly after. That night, as he pieced together names and dates on the wall of his cabin, the pattern was undeniable. Every road, every record, every disappearance pointed back to that one decaying farmhouse hidden in the Kentucky woods. The Ellis name was still there, written like a curse that refused to die, binding generation after generation to a house that should have fallen long ago. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of history and light, the last of them was still alive. The deeper the filmmaker dug, the more the records began to twist together into something grotesque. He started noticing repetition not just in names, but in entire lifespans, children born from parents who were also siblings, cousins who married and had children of their own who repeated the same cycle. The Ellis family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a closed loop, curling inward until it strangled itself. Generations had lived and died without ever introducing new blood, their lineage locked within the walls of that house in the hollow. The documents spoke of an existence so isolated that even time seemed to forget them. Birth certificates listed fathers and mothers with the same last name, sometimes even the same middle initials. In some, the word unknown replaced both parents' names, as if the clerks had stopped trying to make sense of it. He began to cross-reference the records with old medical notes and asylum admissions from nearby counties. Buried among them were vague references to degenerative conditions, facial malformations, and communication deficiencies among children bearing the Ellis surname. One record described a child found wandering near the edge of the forest in 1961, mute, frail, and unable to walk upright. The sheriff's report had marked the child as a vagrant before the file abruptly ended. No follow-up was recorded, no adoption, no burial. It was as though the child had simply vanished again, swallowed by the woods that birthed him. The filmmaker began to suspect that the family's isolation had not been a matter of choice, but of shame. Perhaps they had withdrawn when deformities and mental illness began to show among their children, when whispers from nearby towns turned cruel, when neighbors refused to look them in the eye. Generation after generation, they must have convinced themselves that purity lay in staying together, that outsiders were the cause of their suffering. Each generation tried to erase the last by hiding it deeper, keeping the children away, never letting them see the world beyond the woods. At night, staring at the web of notes pinned to his cabin wall, he realized that what he had uncovered wasn't just a forgotten family, it was a living experiment in isolation. Their bloodline had eaten itself alive, reshaping flesh and mind into something both familiar and alien. Every generation bore the marks of those before, until humanity became blurred by its own reflection. The Ellis name had turned from legacy to curse, and their home in the hollow had become their prison. The filmmaker couldn't shake the feeling that the family's decision to stay hidden wasn't only about keeping the world out, it was about keeping something far worse from getting out. It was an encounter with a local hunter that turned the filmmaker's investigation from curiosity into fear. The man was weathered, his hands rough and scarred, his eyes clouded with memories he tried not to recall. They met in the back corner of the town's only bar, where the lights were dim and the conversations low. When the filmmaker mentioned the hollow, the hunter froze for a long moment, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. He said he had been there once, though he swore he'd never go back. It was early autumn, the season when the fog hung heavy and the forest floor whispered underfoot. He had followed a wounded deer deeper into the trees than he should have, tracking its blood trail until he realized how quiet everything had become. The usual sounds of the woods, birds, wind, the rustle of life, had vanished. What replaced it was a stillness so complete it pressed against his chest like weight. He remembered the feeling of being watched before he saw anything. Then came movement, slight, quick, and wrong. From behind a cluster of trees, he glimpsed figures, small and hunched, their shapes distorted as if the forest itself was bending around them. At first he thought they were children, but something about the way they moved shattered that illusion. Their limbs were uneven, their gait unnatural, dragging and twitching in ways no human should. He raised his rifle, but fear paralyzed him. One of them turned toward him, and though the distance was great, he swore its eyes glowed in the fading light, reflecting something feral and empty. It made no sound, only tilted its head, and then disappeared into the fog. He ran until his lungs burned, and when he finally reached his truck, he found long scratches across the door, as though something with small but sharp fingers had tried to open it. The hunter told the filmmaker he'd never gone back into those woods, not even in daylight. The deer, he said, was the lucky one. The filmmaker listened, his recorder running, capturing every tremor in the man's voice. The hunter's story could have been dismissed as drunken fantasy, but something in his tone, something heavy and broken, made it impossible to ignore. That night, back at his cabin, the filmmaker replayed the recording again and again. In the background, barely audible, there was a faint noise, something that hadn't come from the hunter. It was soft, distant, and high-pitched, like laughter, or crying, carried through the static. He told himself it was interference, a trick of the MIC, but deep down he knew it was something else. Whatever lived in the hollow wasn't just hiding, it was watching, waiting, and aware that someone was coming closer. The discovery of the cellar began with a rumor, one that had been whispered by an old surveyor who had once worked for the county decades ago. He claimed that the Ellis farmhouse had more beneath it than anyone realized, a network of rooms dug deep into the earth, sealed long ago after something unspeakable had been found there. The filmmaker took the story as myth at first, another piece of rural folklore meant to scare children. But when he finally reached the outskirts of the Ellis property, he began to suspect otherwise. The house stood like a corpse on stilts, its roof collapsed on one side, its windows boarded from the inside. The air smelled of rotten iron, and the ground around it sank unevenly, suggesting hidden spaces below. The trees that surrounded it seemed to grow inward, forming a wall of branches as if the forest itself wanted to keep what was buried there from escaping. He spent hours circling the property, filming from a distance, afraid to get too close. In the fading light of dusk, he noticed something strange. Part of the foundation behind the house was newer, patched with cement that didn't match the rest of the structure. The earth there was disturbed, softer than the rest. When he brushed away the leaves and dirt, his hand struck metal. Beneath the soil lay a hatch, rusted and chained shut. The links were old but thick, and the padlock looked recently replaced. Someone had been there. Someone was still trying to keep whatever was inside from coming out. That night, as he camped nearby, the forest grew restless. Faint sounds drifted through the trees, scraping, tapping, like metal dragging across stone. He tried to convince himself it was the wind, but there was no wind that night. In the morning, he returned to the hatch, only to find the ground around it disturbed again. Footprints, bare, small, and deep, circled the area before disappearing into the woods. Some were shaped almost like human feet, but not quite. The toes were longer, the arches twisted. He recorded everything, whispering notes into his microphone, his voice trembling though he didn't realize it. By late afternoon, he could no longer resist the pull of what lay below. He pried at the lock, the metal shrieking in protest until it gave way. When the chains fell, a rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it a smell that made him gag, a stench of decay, dampness, and something animal. He lowered his light into the darkness and saw stairs descending into the earth, narrow and slick with age. The air felt alive, vibrating faintly with sound. Somewhere below, beyond the reach of his light, something moved. He didn't yet know it, but that cellar wasn't just a place of hiding, it was a tomb, and not all its occupants were dead. The first sound reached him before he even stepped fully into the cellar. It was faint, so faint that he thought it might have been his imagination, the echo of a whimper carried up the narrow staircase. He paused, holding his breath, the camera light trembling in his hand. The air below was thick and wet, every breath tasting of rust and mildew. He called out once, his voice bouncing against the stone walls, but the only answer was silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, came another sound, a low, dragging shuffle, followed by something like laughter. It wasn't joyous laughter but soft, broken, and uneven, as though the one making it didn't fully understand what laughter was supposed to sound like. As he descended, the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that clings to skin and seeps into bone. The steps creaked beneath his feet, each one threatening to give way. The beam of his flashlight caught fragments of the cellar, a row of rusted shelves, jars filled with unrecognizable remains, and stains on the wall that time hadn't managed to erase. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell became. At the base of the stairs, he found a narrow hallway leading into several small chambers carved from the earth. The walls were uneven, clawed as though someone had tried to dig their way out. The noises grew clearer the farther he moved. At times, it sounded like crying, soft, rhythmic, desperate. Then, just as suddenly, it would shift to quiet giggling, the sound of something playing in the dark. He turned his camera toward one of the chambers and froze. Against the far wall, he saw shapes, bundled forms that at first seemed like piles of rags. But when his light caught them fully, he realized they were bodies. Some were skeletal, others half-preserved, their limbs distorted, bones bending where they shouldn't. In the corner, he saw movement. Something small crouched there, its skin pale and stretched, its head too large for its body. It turned toward the light, and for a heartbeat, he saw its eyes, wide, glassy, and filled not with malice, but confusion. He stumbled backward, the camera shaking wildly, his breath breaking into sharp gasps. The childlike figure didn't move closer, but another sound rose from the darkness behind it, more voices, whispering, shifting, as if others were awakening. He realized the laughter he'd heard before hadn't been a single voice. It had been many, overlapping, echoing through the tunnels like an unholy chorus. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity anchored him in place. He could feel the weight of generations pressing against the walls, their secrets breathing around him. Whatever was making those sounds wasn't simply haunting the cellar, it was living in it. When the filmmaker finally returned to the farmhouse, it was under the cover of a storm. Rain pounded the roof, lightning flashing through the trees like fractured veins of light, and the forest seemed to move with every gust of wind. He had been gone for 2 days, unable to sleep since what he'd heard in the cellar, but something inside him refused to let the mystery rest. He told himself he needed evidence, something tangible to prove what he had seen and heard. His camera battery was full, his flashlight replaced, and every step he took toward that house felt like walking into a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The hatch was still open when he arrived, rainwater flooding down the stairs, and the smell rising from below was worse than before. Yet, beneath the roar of the storm, he could still hear the faint, rhythmic sound, the crying, or maybe the laughter, echoing like a memory calling him back. He descended carefully, his boots slipping on the wet steps, the beam of his light trembling along the walls. The tunnels seemed deeper than before, the air thicker. He felt as though the house itself was shifting above him, alive and breathing. Then the light caught something new, a door at the end of the hallway he hadn't noticed during his first descent. It was made of wood and sealed with iron bolts, though some had rusted loose. His heart pounded as he reached for the latch, every instinct screaming to turn back, but the need to know was stronger than the fear clawing at his chest. When he forced the door open, the smell of rot and despair burst out like a living thing. Inside, the beam of his light revealed a small, stone-walled room lined with old iron cribs and rusted bed frames. On the walls, Faint carvings, scratches made by small hands, covered every surface. And in the far corner, lying in a nest of torn blankets and filth, was something moving. The figure shifted weakly, its skin pale and slick, its face half hidden in shadow. It turned toward the light and whimpered softly, a sound so human and so broken it stopped his breath. Then came the movement, behind him, around him, from every direction. He spun the camera, catching glimpses of other forms emerging from the dark, small, twisted bodies crawling along the walls, their eyes glinting white in the beam. They didn't rush him, they only stared, swaying gently, as though curious about the intruder who had broken their silence. The air filled with that strange sound again, crying, laughing, whispering, all at once. He stumbled backward, tripping on the uneven floor, his camera still rolling as the light flickered. The last thing he captured before the beam went out completely was a face pressed close to his lens, eyes wide, mouth open, not in anger, but in something closer to recognition. The footage that surfaced months later was found by a pair of hikers who had ventured too far into the Kentucky woods. They discovered his camera half buried in the mud near the edge of the hollow, its lens cracked, the battery long dead. When investigators recovered the memory card, they expected to find footage of wilderness landscapes or perhaps another failed documentary attempt. What they found instead was something else entirely. The video began shakily, the filmmaker's voice whispering about the family, his words clipped by panic. His breathing was loud, uneven, and the camera's light flickered as if struggling against the darkness around him. Most of the footage was distorted images blurring, frames missing, the sound warped by static, but what remained was enough to make even seasoned investigators stop watching halfway through. The final moments captured the inside of the farmhouse, the camera panning over walls covered in strange drawings, spirals, faces, and symbols etched with something dark and dried. A child's voice could be heard faintly, humming a tune with no melody. Then the filmmaker spoke softly, his tone trembling, saying he had found them. The light swayed, and for an instant, several figures appeared in the beam, pale shapes pressed against the walls, motionless, watching. Their features were misshapen, their bodies half hidden in shadow. When one of them stepped closer, the light caught its face. Its eyes were wide but empty, its mouth forming words no one could understand. The camera dropped suddenly, landing sideways, still recording. The screen filled with movement, bare feet, elongated hands, flashes of faces, all too close, too fast. There were no screams, only a low, guttural hum, like 100 voices murmuring in unison. Then the feed cut out. The authorities who reviewed the footage declared it inconclusive, blaming damage and poor lighting for the distortions. The official report stated that the filmmaker had likely fallen victim to an accident, lost in the woods during the storm, his body never recovered. But among the locals, a different story spread quietly. They said he had found what generations before him had been warned to leave buried, that the Ellis family never died out, only retreated further underground. Some claimed they could still hear faint crying in the forest at night, carried on the wind after rain. Others said that if you listened closely, you could hear the clicking sound of a camera somewhere in the dark, still recording, waiting for someone else to come looking. The footage was locked away, but the legend grew louder, feeding the same silence that had hidden the Ellis bloodline for over a century, ensuring that the truth, like the family itself, would never fully die.